Here. I'm so happy you're all here. I'm Isabell May. I am associate professor in the graduate school where I teach in the science communication program. And this summer, the baton was passed on to me from Michelle Pierce to direct the program. Thank you. Michelle has done a wonderful job in building the program. And so I'm excited to continue that amazing work she started. And in that program, I teach the first two courses. There's and I give you a little bit of a background of that because I'll be drawing some examples from some of those classes. And just for you to understand where I'm coming from with my approach towards teaching writing, which is really kind of 100% of what I do. So I don't teach a course on epidemiology or, that's the one topic I can think of right now, but whatever topic content that you teach and writing becomes sort of a vehicle for that content. I just teach sort of writing related stuff. So I have a lot more freedom and space to dedicate to writing, and I should, right? Because that's really what I'm teaching, than many of you do. But I'm hoping that some of that experience and some of my approaches and some of the research I have read over decades around writing pedagogies can actually support you and help you in maybe thinking about some of your assignments, some of the way you approach writing in your classes a bit differently. But I'm expecting that a lot of the stuff that I'm going to tell you today is not going to be totally new to you. And I'm suspecting that most of the things I'm going to be telling you, many of you, if not all of you, are doing already in some way, shape, or form, or have done at some point. So it's kind of a refresher as well as maybe something new, I hope, in there for you to take away from. So before we get started, though, I do want to start us off with a land acknowledgement. And I do need to give credit here to my colleague in the Writing Center, our Associate Director, James Wright, who I'm going to mention later on as well. He developed this with a few community leaders. So I'm just going to read through this and then we get started. So the Writing Center, which is also a place that I direct on top of the science communication program, so I wear multiple hats. We acknowledge Indigenous peoples past, present, and future as the rightful and traditional protectors and caretakers of their native lands in what is known today as the United States. We recognize that as an institutional part of the University of Maryland, Baltimore, our center's digital and non-digital spaces participate in the historical, ongoing, and violent legacy of land theft initiated by white colonialist settlers who first invaded the Chesapeake region in the 17th century. Specifically, the Writing Center operates on the ancestral lands of Iroquoian-speaking Susquehannock peoples and Algonquian-speaking peoples of the Cedarville Band of the Piscataway Conoy, the Piscataway Indian Nation, and the Piscataway Conoy tribe, all of whom shared this area through their relations and whose descendants are thriving and resisting settler occupation. We also acknowledge our complicity in the historical, deliberate, and ongoing attempts by settlers, apologize for the typo there, and their systems of oppression to appropriate indigenous cultures, ignore or break treaties with sovereign native nations, and perpetrate and obfuscate racist and violent acts of political, social, economic, and ecological white supremacy. We further acknowledge the fundamental role that these colonialist acts have and continue to play in the historical and contemporary disenfranchisement, surveillance, and harm of Black Americans. Recognizing these intertwining injustices, this land acknowledgement serves as an opening to contemplate the continuing resistance to colonial indoctrination through various Indigenous and Black movements for identity, freedom, and self-determination. We commit our sites of learning to ending anti-Black racism, modern colonialism, and white supremacy, and to creating equitable relations that honor and heal communities and the land. We further advocate for ecological, relational, social, and political restoration and healing through the return of Native and Indigenous lands to their sovereign, rightful stewards. There is the link to our land acknowledgement. We also added, or James and his collaborators added a bunch of different organizations that if you're interested in particularly donating to, please check it out. We would love to support these organizations. And I'm putting the land acknowledgement in here because it is just a best practice as part of an anti-racist institution, but also because really addressing standards and standard English as part of writing instruction and also sort of white supremacist language practices really play a role in our design and our, and the way that we work with students in writing classrooms or in classrooms where writing plays a role. And I'll mention this throughout the presentation as well. All right, so, excuse me. So there's two challenges, maybe two opportunities. I like to look at challenges, opportunities in a way, positive spin on things, right? In sort of the title of this presentation today. And one of it has to do with teaching graduate level writers, right? And that is really a particular task that's super interesting, but also challenging because graduate level writers have to follow discipline-specific writing conventions, and they have to use specific and sometimes unique genres. And I'll talk about genres a lot in a moment. So if you have any questions about the term, I'll explain it in a second, the way that we use it in writing assessment. And then, of course, the other challenge is we're teaching in online classrooms. Even though I think that I actually really appreciate teaching writing in online classrooms a lot more than in face-to-face classrooms, maybe because I haven't been doing anything else for the last few years, but I see there's a lot of opportunity for some really great instruction around writing in online classrooms. But the key really here is to create consistent and meaningful feedback practices. And I'll talk about that a lot throughout the next few minutes here. And also to develop assignments that build on each other and provide plenty of room for revision, because we need to give our students room to revise based on our feedback and then get our feedback again on the revision. That is an absolutely key element in how I think students learn. And often I think we maybe give some feedback on a draft, but then we don't really look, or we might not be able to do it. Our classes might not design that way. So I want to really encourage you to think about, what are some ways to do that? And I'll show you some examples from my teaching as well. Excuse me. I swallowed you wrongly. So let me give you a short primer on genres, just to get us all on the same page, because it's kind of a jargony term that I think everybody knows what I mean when I say genre, but maybe not. So genre, really what I mean by genre is a stylistic category of writing. So a literature review, a research paper, a report, an op-ed, and let me see, Flav, you mentioned a journal article, reflection paper, right? That's a genre in itself. A manuscript, if it follows the IMRAD format, like introduction, methods, results, discussion, that's a particular genre. So we all, discussion forum is a genre. And then there's, of course, genres within genres, right? But I'm not going to get too better on this. But that's what I mean by genre. And it's a real foundational category for writing pedagogies. And I do want to provide a definition of what pedagogy means, because sometimes, like, what exactly is it? So it's really the method and practice of teaching. And in this case, writing pedagogy, the method and practice of teaching writing. And this has been developed, or these pedagogies have been developed by folks who predominantly teach in English programs or writing programs where the courses are focused predominantly on writing. So most of you are all in a slightly different role where your main goal is to teach the pedagogy of nursing, the pedagogy of, public health, whatever it is. And writing is sort of wrapped into that. But again, I hope that you'll be able to take away some of the things from us writing pedagogy folks into your classrooms. Other terminology that's used with genre-based writing pedagogy. So now that you all know what genre and pedagogy mean, I'm going to throw this big term at you, the genre-based writing pedagogy, rhetorical situation and rhetorical moves. And I think these are really useful, even if you never use them in your own classrooms, but knowing what they mean can really, I think, inform how you explain to students what happens. And in a way, what I've done earlier in our conversation that we've had before I started with my slides, when Andrea and Catherine were talking about, according to, that's a rhetorical move, right? According to Johnson, recent, blah, 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 as shown, side effects or whatever are. That's a rhetorical move, the according to. That is something that we can teach to students, but we have to really be, we have to unearth them from what we sometimes take for granted that students will know. So we have to make sure that we're clear around, what are some of the rhetorical moves, the common practices in our writing habits within our disciplines? And often I don't think we explain it enough. And I am as guilty as charged there as well. So let me talk a little bit through some of these elements and then give some suggestions and show some examples for you before we open it up for some more conversation, because I'm curious to hear from you a little bit more as well. So let's talk about rhetoric, because I do mention rhetorical moves or rhetorical situation. And that's a really great tool that you can introduce to your students. And I'm going to give you a few resources here that you can actually add to your syllabi, to your courses online for students to look into and integrate into your teaching if you like. But what rhetoric means, right, it's a term that describes the art and craft of persuasion. That's how it originally started. But rhetoric now can mean really, and not just persuasion, but any kind of writing. And And if you ask me, I think that all writing in a way is persuasive, even if it's even a literature review that's maybe not very persuasive, that's more sort of gives an overview. There is always, I think, an element of persuasion to persuade at least a reader to read what we've written. So I think persuasion, that's just my personal theory, is an inherent part of writing. And, you know, that's a philosophical argument we can have anytime if you like. But so rhetoric is somebody who studies rhetoric or is considered an expert, is often called a rhetorician. That's a tough word for me to say. So rhetoric is a field of study that is interested in understanding how to communicate. And I'm telling you all this because this is the thing that I'd like you to take away from. And I've put in the bottom here, once you get the slides, you can click on it. There's a short video that I've recorded on what we call the rhetorical situation. It's a really helpful tool to explain to students that we're not just writing to get, you know, the paper done and submitted and move on to the next thing in our lives, but we're really communicating in a very complex situation. And the way that a lot of rhetoric folks explain it is by this triangle, where you have the audience, or audiences, I should say, really, the writer, and the issue. And in the video, I go into some more details in that. So, and it's really kept on a very basic level. So it's a great introductory video towards helping writers to think about, okay, when I'm writing, what are the different components? There's me, the writer, there are my audiences. And I always encourage my students to think about audiences, not just as me, the grader or the evaluator of the paper, but as, you know, are they writing it? If it's a journal article reflection paper, who they assume is their audience? Somebody who's familiar with certain jargon in these journals, or do they have to explain things more? Is it a general audience? Michelle teaches a great course in our program about communicating with the public, right? There's a lot of conversation in her course, a lot of work that goes into thinking about how do we communicate best with audiences not familiar with our topics. So, you know, and it's a very sophisticated, I think, intellectual labor moment when we think about who we're writing for, because it determines the kind of way that we present our material. And then there's, of course, the issue, like, what are we writing about? And the video goes into some greater detail. So take a look at it. It's something that you can add easily to your Blackboard course. And it's something I encourage instructors to do early on when they start with their first writing assignment, even for a discussion forum, to get students thinking about, you know, what this complex act of writing is very complex. And this triangle kind of explains all the different tangents that go into it in a pretty straightforward way. And, you know, and when we talk about sort of standards and certain rhetorical moves and things that are, you know, that are expected of folks in certain disciplines, I do want to point out this uncomfortable truth. And uncomfortable, actually, it's uncomfortable truth to me, as you know, a white identifying female, cisgendered female, that common writing standards and genre convention are based on white language supremacy, Western history of colonization and anti-Blackness, and the devaluation of other Englishes. So, but so in the grand scheme of things, does this mean that we don't teach students standards? Not necessarily, but I think we do owe our students, particularly in this day and age, that we complicate the notion of what is a standard. And then if we teach certain standards, we need to also let students know that there are ways to push back against standards depending on, again, the rhetorical situation. Where do they fall? Do they have a moment of, do they have some power in a situation? If they don't, they have to submit something to a journal, and the journal tells them to only use passive voice. Well, if they want to get published there, they have to just write only in passive voice. That's a crazy rule, by the way. I don't think any journal requires you to do that, but just as a hypothetical example. But then we can also have conversations with them around, like, well, why is it passive voice? Who benefits from using passive voice? So that's what I mean by really complicating and thinking more deeply behind what we sometimes just take at face value as standards and principles. I'll go a lot more into this when I go in January. I think I'm giving a talk on anti-racist writing assessment and labor-based grading, and I'll go into more depth about this, but I did want to include it here because when we talk about genres and standards, there's actually a way we can address this in a very integrative and sort of low-hanging fruit kind of way. And I do want to talk about a scholar in writing pedagogy. Her name is Christine Tardy. She talks about this concept of genre innovation, because as much as we think that, like, let's say the IMRAD format for research manuscripts, that's the way everybody publishes. You look at 4 different journals and you'll see a lot of variations of this IMRAD. Some people call it background. Some journals want the methods last. So there is variation, even though there is a certain standard that we all operate within. If you look at a journal article in a science journal 70 years ago, it doesn't look anything like a journal article looks like today. So there, things change over time as well. So this idea of genre innovation, to really let students know, we have a certain genre that we're using here. It's not static. They adapt and, are based on context. Again, that's where the rhetorical triangle really comes in handy, depending on audience, writer, and issue. They have continued and continue to develop over time. So who knows what a research manuscript in 20 years will look like? It'll be interesting to see. And genres are negotiated differently in different cultural contexts. So if we look at journals that are published in different cultural contexts, we can see a lot of variation. And then specific genres have specific rhetorical moves. And again, going back to this principle of rhetoric, this idea of certain standard practices that, and again, some of the variation within there, if we focus on these to teach our students, like the example from the conversation earlier, well, according to might really work well if you're introducing a big concept, but if you're just sort of giving basic information, I don't need to know who the source is. That's a really great example of a rhetorical move for how to write with research, and really foregrounding that and making that visible in a topic of conversation and instruction in our classrooms that include writing is a game changer. I really believe it's a game changer. That's my hypothesis. So rhetorical moves, let me explain a little bit more what I mean by them. It's a term that was coined by John Swales, who's done a lot of work in the field of writing pedagogy and genres. And I have by the way, I have a slide at the very end with some additional resources where you see these names come up. So if you want to do some more reading on these, feel free to check them out. Contact me anytime. I gladly talk to you about this anytime, literally. Maybe not in the middle of the night, but anytime. I'm happy to talk more about this. This is something I'm really passionate about, and I think can really change not just your students' experiences, which is really important, but also your experience as an instructor who uses writing in the classroom. So you don't get frustrated, hopefully, as easily by students not following, not doing what they're supposed to, right? So that's my hope for all of us, fingers crossed, or maybe not as much of that. So a rhetorical move is a strategy to enhance one's argument, right? Something that works. So it's a pattern or structure found in a text. Like according to these author tags are certain rhetorical moves. They can be very minuscule, however, is a rhetorical move for introducing an oppositional argument. Therefore, is a rhetorical device, a rhetorical move to introduce another, like a conclusion of something. And they can also be more complex. And I'll give you some examples from a course that I teach in a sec. But I want to show you 2 resources that I use in MHS 603, Science Writing Principles, our foundational course in the science communication program. This is from the George Washington University, and I'm going to click on the link here. Sorry, I opened the chat. That was a mistake. So here is the George Washington University's, just briefly, just to show you. So describing your topic. So, and this is very undergraduate-y, so take it with a grain of salt, some of the language in here, but I think it gives an example to students and to us instructors alike of what this means. So I am studying blank in order to learn blank, which is significant because whatever, rather than I'm doing X. Right? So it really shows students certain skeleton phrases. That's the term that John Swales has used a lot in his work as well. And I'll show you an example that the way that I have my students work with this. Certain skeleton phrases where you can just plug in your content basically. And it's a great way for folks to practice how to make an argument, either developing ideas, complicating it, and so on. So that's one of the sources. Again, this is going to be very quick. You can click on them and look through them as much as you like later. The other one comes from a blog, and I like this blog entry because it links to many other great websites, and it's about understanding rhetorical moves and meta language. It's another term that's often used for this. I like rhetorical moves better. It's personal choice. One great thing actually to do is analyze articles in your field. So if you're requiring students to write about journal articles, what is it that, maybe do a discussion section on like, hey, we've read this article last week about X for content. But when we step back, what are some of the ways these authors introduce their argument? What are they doing in the intro? And it's a quick exercise you can do with them. It doesn't have to be, a 3-page paper about it. My exercise on these are probably longer because that's my bread and butter, but that's the main thing that I teach. But you can easily integrate that. And having students look at some examples text, not just for reading the content, but looking at, hey, how are these writers actually doing what they're doing? And then, so sentence skeletons comes up here again, and it has this wonderful resource here, the Academic Phrase Bank from the University of Manchester, that I use this a lot with students who are not like myself, writers for whom English is not the first language. I want to click on this briefly so you'll see what it looks like. It has all these different language functions, they call it, describing quantities, explaining causality. So I want to click on one, verbs indicating causality, and it explains it. It's such a rich resource. You can get lost in it for hours. So know that it's there. It's from the University of Manchester, and it's a wonderful way, if you want to use some of it to construct an assignment or give as a resource to students. It's really wonderful. Students consistently love this phrase bank. When I do some work with it in my courses or give it as a resource. It's the one people comment on that a lot in my evaluations. So those are two things that you can use, student facing, so to speak, integrate into your classrooms easily, where you can point students towards like, hey, here are some ways that people have put together some material, how we do writing in research-based kind of fields, right? So easy low-hanging fruit. So let me switch a little bit to online classrooms, coming out of this discussion around genre and rhetoric. I have found just briefly that the Quality Matters framework is helpful when I develop my writing assignments. So if none of you have worked with the wonderful folks in the Faculty Center for Teaching and Learning on this for your online courses, do, because it really helps to develop your objectives. Just like we ask students to develop an outline, right? We do the same thing. So I just want to put a plug in there. For that, because I've really enjoyed that. It has really enriched my teaching. I think making room for peer-to-peer feedback in an online classroom is really great. That's a whole other presentation I could give for like 20, 30 minutes easily. But so if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask me, but I want to point it out there. But I do want to focus on these practical tips on the bottom here, because I want to integrate those with what I've talked about, genre analysis, rhetorical moves, give you some examples of how I give feedback on students' writing, and maybe give you some ideas of how you can adapt some of those strategies. And just practically, I love Blackboard. Well, let me put it this way. I appreciate Blackboard for what it can do for us. I don't think it looks really great, but that's, I have some pet peeves, but I appreciate for what it can do. What I find limiting sometimes is the comment function in Blackboard. So I have started downloading my students' papers as Word documents and make comments and send them back a copy of it, either through Blackboard or via email, especially if it's a draft that they're working on, rather than using the Blackboard comment functions. Some of you might be like, I never use them. You're light years ahead of me. I sometimes like using them for shorter assignments where it's not so critical, but so I really like using the Word function. And other colleagues of mine use Google Docs for all of their writing instruction. So it's really the idea that students get the feedback in the text, and then they can right with that document with your feedback there, rather than having to go between two screens. Okay. I really, I want to put a plug in here, and this is another larger conversation. I love what Michelle said earlier about like not becoming the editor, right? It's really hard. I get it. I fall short every single time I give feedback on a student's paper. Now, I don't change anything in their papers, but I might be like, oh, add comma here. Frankly, I'm okay with that because I teach them comma, right? Comma and punctuation is part of one of my modules. So I feel I might be able to get away with it, and it's something that you can offer as well, but that shouldn't be your main focus of your interaction with your students' writing. Don't become grammar and sentence level. If you do that, you will drive yourself into an early grave of writing assessment, because you can get lost in it. And I know how hard it is, because I have my pet peeves around, why can't you use the semicolon with however, why is there a comma? It drives me nuts. But I also had to learn, like, you gotta step back, because is the argument there? So it's a real, it takes practice. Sometimes it takes me stepping away from a student's paper and coming back to it, just FYI. And so rather than doing that and becoming these sort of like grammar sentence level editors, which again is really easy, and you'll probably continue doing that, but maybe you do it less, just like I hopefully do it less. to really react as a reader and ask questions. And I'm going to show you some examples on how to do that. This is the main method that most writing pedagogues in my field, the way that we train our writing consultants and writing centers. And I think that faculty you can really get further with guiding your students in a revision process if you ask questions rather than just, making comments without engaging on that level. So coming from a reader's perspective is a powerful tool. And I'll show you how I do that in just a sec. So this is going to be my main focus in just a second. So let's get back to some practical tips here. What does all of this mean for our teaching, right? Like, whoa, that's a lot of information in genre and rhetoric. But it's really about engaging students in conversations about the genres we are asking them to produce. So Flav, when you talked about the journal article reflection paper and you described what you're doing, I thought it sounds more like an analysis, like a real reflection, right? And so sometimes and I do the same thing, I think I'm having students write analysis and it turns out to be a reflection. So sometimes we have to also step back ourselves and be like, well, am I really describing in great detail what I want students to do? Am I using the right language? And sometimes we can't win because one student will interpret it another way, but I think that kind of reflective practice is important. And I'm a big fan of giving examples to students when it's appropriate. I've given a lot more sample papers out in the for different assignments that I've created over the past year than I ever have, and it has changed the quality of the products. It's unbelievable that I'm getting, like the texts. I'll talk about this a little bit later. But again, these conversations about genres, and part of that conversation is providing like a sample text, like here is a good paragraph, and this is why it's good. That's why it works well. Engage students in conversation about the common genres in the field profession, right? So what are some common genres students have to write? And most importantly, are the genres you're asking them to write reflecting the genres they will have to be writing in their professions? And if they're not, then we really need to look back at like, okay, where's the disconnect here? Or we might want to even explain, I'm asking you to write this genre because this is going to be similar to XYZ, or will help you do these skills that you will need to do this later on in your profession. Let's be transparent about this as much as possible. Students appreciate transparency a lot. Like I do too, so I get it. And again, I'm saying this again, examples, sample paper, sample paragraph, another example of something you already explained. Never hurts to have another example. Honestly, never hurts. Maybe if you have like 100 examples from one little thing, that might be too much, you know what I mean? But having a few examples is always a good idea. And I'm a big fan of analyzing sample text. I mentioned this earlier. So again, a lot of this I've already mentioned, but those are some concrete things that I think really enrich our teaching when we include writing as part of our assessment. I'm going to skip over this, but I encourage you to take a look at this later. This is a statement from the Conference on College Composition and Communication. It's the annual conference by the National NCTE, National Council of Teachers of English, which is my sort of guiding professional organization. And they published in 2019 this great statement of professional guidance for mentoring graduate students. And one of the things, like the headline right here is, right, make academic practices and conventions accessible. So a lot of demystifying. I don't think we do this enough. And I think it's because we become so used to it. It's just like when I write a paper and I give it to, and I submit it and I get feedback from the reviewers, this needs more explanation. I'm like, really? And then I'm like, oh yes, it does. Oops, my bad, right? It happens to us as well. So in our teaching, we need to be very cognizant about this. So I'm going to skip over this and I'm going to show you a slide here from one of my courses on the journal article. It's called Tips and Tricks for an Effective Introduction, which really are the rhetorical moves I'm covering. So here are some examples for rhetorical moves that I encourage students to start looking for in introduction sections of research manuscripts that follow the IMRAD format. Write a section for the general audience, keep jargon to a minimum, and so on. You see some examples here. And this is just one slide out of a few presentations and videos I've recorded for my students. And then I ask them to either write an introduction themselves if they're working on a manuscript, or they have to analyze a couple of texts and find where are some of these rhetorical moves in the article. Like where do the authors clearly state their hypothesis, or don't they? Do they do it clearly enough? Do they mention the research gap, right? So the things that, again, we often take for granted, and we forget that our students might not be nearly as familiar with them as we are. And again, here are some more resources that go with that module. If you want to take a look at those, at my videos, you can listen to me many more minutes talking about something I'm passionate about, writing introductions, but just to give you a better idea of, of what I'm, the way that I do these do my classes. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here some more because I do want to focus on putting your reader's hat on. So I'm a big fan of not using phrases like, oh, this is awkward, this is not clear, but rather, and this is again, I love the expression, as a reader, I'm struggling here. As a reader, I'm hearing, reading this, I'm hearing you say this. Is that what you mean? Rather than saying awkward, unclear, because it draws the student in and it actually will force you to maybe provide some more explanation why you're not understanding it. And that then will help the student revise accordingly. I can't tell you that this works 100% all the time, but it works really well most of the time in my experience, having worked with lots of introductory writers. Point out things that students do well. Don't be afraid to actually rephrase a sentence for a student. I'm going to show you an example in a second how I do that, because people are like, oh my God, they're going to just copy and paste it and I'm doing the work for them. I have not, and I've done some analysis on this on some of my paper drafts. Most students will not copy exactly what you're writing, but they will take some of it and then sort of do a variation of it. And that's how we learn, right? I mean, that's how we learn. We take something from something else and make it our own. So really kind of, some tangible things to do. And I'll show you some examples here quickly. Here is, for example, an example where I say, as a reader, I expect to learn something about the efficacy around healthcare services for new refugees. Students was writing about this. Remember, you're not putting together a fact sheet. My biggest peeve is like just facts, facts, facts. I'm like, what's the argument? They have to write an argumentative thesis statement here, but you're also presenting an argument around refugees and healthcare services. And the students find this as a draft. The students' final paper was right on with that. Right on. I gave a lot more feedback than this, just FYI, but that's just one example where I use that phrase as a reader, like, hey, I'm expecting this. This is my example for summative feedback. Sorry, I didn't mention this before, but in-text comments are super important for passage-specific feedback. I would also provide some summative feedback. This is very lengthy. That's because I give a lot of feedback on these drafts because it's an introductory writing course. Keep this in mind. It doesn't have to be this lengthy to be effective, not at all, but that's just the style. And this is a paper that needed a lot of feedback. And I want to highlight one passage here. So where I really sort of engage with the structure, right? Hey, make sure you don't jump from one thing to the end. The one biggest thing I always find students don't do well with is transitions. And I relate to that because I have to always revise for that as well. But since I'm getting a first draft of something here that students probably didn't do too much work with, this is how I guide them in their revision process. And then one last thing, the example I want to show you for a phrase that I give them. So to move away, this is a topic sentence kind of introductory moment in one of my courses. To move away from the language, like another aspect that blah blah writes about, this article was an article review. I'm like, this is not bad as in like introducing me to a new concept, but there's maybe a more elegant way, for the lack of a better word, and that sounds very judgy, but maybe a more effective way. So in addition to discussing, so I give a sentence here, right? This whole sentence in the middle is something that I put together based on the content of the paper. And I deliberately don't make it sound really great. I use some simple language most of the time. So students might not be as tempted to just copy and paste, but especially for second language learners, this is one of the best ways students learn. And actually, I believe all language learners in academic writing classrooms, right? Because nobody wakes up, is born with academic English as a native language. So again, some conversation, some suggestions here for you all. I'm curious to hear from you in the last few minutes that we have. I knew I would not have enough time for this, but any immediate thoughts, reactions? I hope this was helpful. It was a lot to cover here. Here is my resource page, so take a look at these. There's some great blogs here. I really recommend Wood and Inouye's blog on different writing aspects. So these are really great and easy kind of things to read through. Any thoughts, comments, folks?